At the E3 conference of 2006, Sony unveiled the new Sixaxis controller for the then upcoming PlayStation 3. Maintaining mostly the same basic shape and functionality as the PlayStation 2 controller, one of the selling points was how they managed to incorporate motion controls into an otherwise normal-looking controller.
As you can see, the body is similar to the most popular PlayStation controllers. But inside this body, we have added powerful and elegant system.
Motion controls for video games weren't a new concept. There have been various attempts at this as far back as the late 1980s.
You Force for Nintendo.
You have in your possession the Sega Activator, the ultimate full-body game controller. It seems simple, because it is. Remember to maintain this numerical configuration for future setups. When hit individually, panels 4 and 6 are like the A button. When hit together, they're the start move. Avoid setting up directly beneath light sources. Also, avoid metallic or mirrored overhead surfaces. Make sure the master panel is facing the TV set. Place the optional stickers on each of the panels.
But there was something different happening in the mid-2000s. Major gaming companies decided to give a focus to motion controls in a way that hadn't been done previously. Instead of being relegated to obscure and terrible peripherals, Nintendo had decided to make it the primary gimmick of their latest console. Less than a year after the announcement of the Nintendo Wii controller, we saw Sony follow suit with the announcement of the Sixaxis controller. During this time, we would see a handful of games try to justify these features by incorporating them in some small way. Whether it be tilt controls or something else, we found motion inputs for games that didn't really need them. Which brings us to today's episode of Demon's Souls Dissected. So, something that might surprise Soulsborne fans who play on PC or Xbox is that these games have been designed with some very minor motion capabilities. And I'm not just talking about Demon's Souls, I'm talking about all of them. Demon's Souls allowed the use of gestures that can be triggered with motion controls, and this feature was kept for the entire Dark Souls trilogy as well as Bloodborne. The end result is that you may bypass the gesture selection menu. I suppose this looks a little bit cooler if you're making a video, allowing your character to seamlessly perform a gesture. This is only available if you're playing on PlayStation consoles using a Sixaxis or one of the later DualShock controllers, with the one exception being Dark Souls Remastered on the Nintendo Switch. Yes, they actually bothered to include this, which is kind of unexpected. In Demon's Souls, the gesture menu appears by holding down the X button on the PlayStation controller for a few moments. In later entries, this was replaced by simply pressing the select or back button, or some other equivalent. But the means to trigger motion controls remain the same. You hold down the bottom face button of your controller, and while holding it down, you shake the controller around. But I've always wanted to know more about why the gestures can be so difficult to achieve. The instructions are often inscrutable, and triggering the wrong gesture is a common problem. It wouldn't take a deep dive to point out the obvious, that we're talking about motion controls, so of course problems are to be expected. But I did find something that will allow us to take a closer look. Some years back, I discovered a menu in the Dark Souls debug that related to the Sixaxis inputs. I was excited at the possibility of seeing how the weird motion controls looked behind the scenes, though I quickly ran into a problem. I couldn't figure out a way to get a PlayStation controller to work with Dark Souls on PC. The only working solution I could find was to emulate an Xbox controller with the PlayStation controller, and the Xbox controller doesn't have the same motion capabilities, of course, so none of the motion data could possibly come through. It felt like one of those situations where I was so close yet so far. However, with Demon's Souls in the PlayStation 3 emulator, I no longer have that problem. I can just plug my controller in, tell the emulator that that's what I'm using, and I'm good to go. So after years of waiting, I finally get to see this. Okay, so it's really not all that exciting, but it does help us break things down. We have 4 readouts that include motion along the X, Y, and Z axes, and rotational data as well. We can adjust the sensitivity of each, and reducing others to 0 allows us to control and test movements along just one axis, regardless of how wildly we swing the controller around. We find that the first 4 gestures are easy enough to interpret. Move left and move right are of course solely mapped to the X-axis, while move up and move down are mapped to the Y-axis. We can also get a better understanding of what the requirement is. It needs to essentially peak the graph in a positive or negative direction along the given axis. You'll notice that smaller or slower movements fail to do this, while faster or more impactful movements achieve this easily. These motions also trigger independently of tilt. It doesn't matter if you're holding the controller parallel or perpendicular to the wall in front of you, it only cares about movement along the X and Y axes for these 4 gestures, which is tracked by acceleration in those directions. But here's where things quickly become a lot more incomprehensible. We have 3 remaining gestures, and their motions are described as thrust forward right, thrust forward left, and wave. Disabling all inputs aside from Z-axis motions reveals that none of these 3 gestures can be triggered by motion here. So it appears that thrusting forwards towards the television, or back towards your body, isn't being used for any gestures at all. We find that going back and toggling all of the other axes one by one all still allow us to trigger the wave gesture if we shake the controller around wildly enough. It appears to be looking to see if any axis, aside from the Z-axis, is peaking in both directions within a certain window of time. This makes enough sense, but it's not as easy to achieve as you might think. In trying to peak an axis in both directions, it seems inclined to sometimes listen to whatever lands first. So it's very easy to trigger another gesture instead of the wave. So what about the 2 gestures I skipped over? The ones triggered by thrust forward left and thrust forward right. Disabling all but rotation reveals that these are triggered by rotation alone. And unlike movements along the X and Y axis, this motion is incredibly finicky and it makes it very difficult to achieve an intended result with any consistency. Maybe it's possible that the Z-axis is still used in some way. Hypothetically, it could combine with the rotational values to help select a particular gesture. But the only problem is that I honestly can't tell a difference when I have those 2 axes on versus just rotation by itself. You would think that being able to control and mute unwanted motions would make this obvious, but it's still incredibly difficult to make sense of it all. The moment I think I've figured out a consistent way to trigger one of these gestures, the more testing I do has me doubting any method I've come up with. This all means that thrust forward right and thrust forward left are governed by some finicky rotational data, and this makes them much harder to achieve intentionally. In addition to the aforementioned issues, there are also regional differences which only confuse things further. For example, in Japanese and North American English, the move up and move down gestures are described to the player correctly. But in the European version of the game, and also when translated to French and Italian, it says to tilt up or tilt down. And in German and Spanish, it says to tilt forward and tilt back. Given that the motion is looking for Y-axis movement and not actual tilting, this means it was explained incorrectly to a lot of players. However, the European version and most translations do suggest a shaking motion to trigger the wave gesture, instead of simply saying wave, which I think is a better wording than what the North American version has. This all goes to show how the explanation of the gestures doesn't neatly match the expected movements. Future titles replaced a written explanation with a visual guide. However, any gestures that use rotational inputs can still be difficult to comprehend and achieve. Fast forward to today, and the excitement surrounding motion controls has almost completely disappeared. We have a better collective understanding of how unreliable motion-based inputs are for triggering anything but the most limited of movesets. Devices that were once meant to be standard would still see additional tools being released to increase their accuracy. Requiring, once again, more tools and more setup, we've since re-relegated motion controls to the periphery. It's not that motion gaming was entirely without success, or that it's always bad and doesn't have any kind of future, but it was hit with a much-needed reality check. In the Souls games, it makes for a novel feature. It's mostly a benign, out-of-the-way sort of thing that some players may appreciate. But in the worst case scenario, it sometimes results in triggering accidental gestures. If you make the mistake of moving the controller too much, and maybe holding the button down just a bit longer than needed when rushing to get an item, it can mess things up for you. It feels like an outdated feature that is only carrying over because the framework for it is already there. If these titles were first being designed today, I doubt this would be in the games at all. However, if From Software is still interested in carrying this over to future titles, like perhaps Elden Ring, I do have a couple suggestions. I think that an option in the menu for toggling it altogether would be a good idea. Though I never personally had much of an issue with it, accidentally gesturing at the wrong time is something you'll hear about every now and again. Additionally, I think they should just completely do away with rotational inputs, and just give us a shorter list of motion-linked gestures that are only mapped to the X and Y motions. With a bit of practice, moving the controller directly up and down, or left and right, is easy enough and you'll get the desired gesture most of the time. Cutting out the weirder and more problematic motions would make it a lot more reliable. But of course, we're talking about an old feature that no one really thinks about, so I doubt the interest to clean things up is there at all. I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope it was informative, and until next time, consider playing around with the motion inputs if you haven't before. This might be a little out of place, but since this was a shorter video, I wanted to quickly respond to the incredible reaction to my most recent Dark Souls Dissected video. Subscriptions and views exploded with my video about Lordran's layout, and I'm very thankful for that. One thing that'll remain true for the series is that no mechanic, no matter how obscure it is off limits. I realized that following up my most popular video with a video about a subject that no one was asking about might be counterproductive, but I'm honestly okay with that. My contributions to the Soul series have always been about providing more information, regardless of how in demand it is. Whenever I can solve a bigger mystery, I'm of course eager to do that, but sometimes I'm just curious about the smaller details as well. That being said, I do also recognize that this video almost certainly didn't scratch the same itch that Lordran's layout did for a lot of viewers. There's something about contextualizing the game space that, of course, is just more deeply fascinating. So with that being said, if you came to this channel because of Lordran's layout, worry not, because my next video is going to be a follow-up video to that. It might take a little while to put together, but I hope you're looking forward to it. And hopefully you also like these deep dives into the weird, mundane stuff too. Thanks again for watching.